Hey you, Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You know how things are always sensationalized for the movies? They're always bigger and more explosive, louder, more devastating. Well, when it comes to the big one, you know, the disastrous mega earthquake that's often seen wiping out entire cities in films like 2012 or San Andreas, we don't actually know how exaggerated those depictions are, because it's been more than 3 centuries since the last one. Now, if you live on the west coast of Canada, you've at least thought about the big one. You might have fretted about it and then just gone back to your normal life, because what are you really going to do about it? But new research published this summer gives us a clearer look than ever before into what this massive megathrust earthquake would look like, and into how we might prepare for it. Does the fact that it's been 324 years since the last one mean we're due? And if we are, what can we actually do about it when it happens? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. John Cassidy is a senior research scientist with Natural Resources Canada, a professor at the University of Victoria, and an expert on the possibility of a big one, or I guess I should say another big one, right, John?
Yeah, exactly, Jordan.
Tell us about the last big one. What happened in 1700?
It's an important point. We 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't know about these big ones, so it's all relatively recent science. But what's been discovered over the past 40 years and what's been out there in Indigenous oral traditions, on January the 26th of the year 1700, one of these huge subduction earthquakes occurred off the west coast of Vancouver Island. And within seconds, the strong shaking would start. Strong shaking for 4 to 5 minutes. About 10 or 15 minutes after the earthquake would be the tsunami. And that tsunami came ashore on Vancouver Island. There are oral traditions from Indigenous groups that describe the impacts on villages on the island. So a winter village near present-day Pachena Bay disappeared on that night. It vanished. It was in the tsunami zone. Villages that were up in the mountains weren't impacted by the tsunami, but they were impacted by strong shaking. And the shaking that's described was so strong that people couldn't stand, that landslides were triggered that destroyed homes, and shaking that continued for more than 24 hours. The shaking for 24 hours would be the strong aftershocks that would continue for days, weeks, months, and even years.
Right.
And then, of course, the tsunami generated by this magnitude 9 earthquake would have traveled across the Pacific. And the exact date and time of this most recent event comes from Japan, where a tsunami came ashore causing damage, but there was no shaking. This wasn't a Japanese earthquake. It was a very distant earthquake. And that tsunami was recorded meticulously. The arrival time and the wave heights were recorded, and the damage was recorded. And so about 20 or 25 years ago, Japanese tsunami researchers were able to work backwards from these arrival times and amplitudes to determine where the tsunami originated. And lo and behold, that tsunami originated off the west coast of North America.
And this is the Cascadia Thrust Fault.
That's exactly right.
And what is that exactly? Where is it located?
Yeah, it's a huge fault. It's 1,100 kilometers long. It runs from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to Northern California, to Cape Mendocino, California. And it's a region where an ocean plate is being pushed beneath North America. This is where these tectonic plates collide and slide past one another, sink, in this case, being pushed beneath the continent. These tend to be around the Pacific Ring of Fire. So the subduction zones around the world are primarily in South America, Mexico, Cascadia off of our coast, Alaska, Japan, and then down into the South Pacific.
And what qualifies this potential earthquake as a big one or a mega thrust earthquake? Like, what's the difference between that and, folks in Vancouver and all across the West Coast are used to fairly regular, sometimes strong earthquakes?
Right. Yeah. And that's a really good point and a really good question. A subduction earthquake, these big magnitude 9s, the shaking may not be much stronger than, say, a magnitude 7 that is closer to you. So the shaking may not be that much stronger. The main difference is, one is the duration of shaking. We're looking at 4 to 5 minutes of strong shaking compared to 10 or 20 or 30 seconds of strong shaking. But the main thing is the area impacted. So because the fault is 1,100 kilometers long, communities all along that region are experiencing strong shaking. So that's the main difference. If you had a magnitude 7 beneath Vancouver, that would be a very strong and damaging earthquake with strong shaking, but it would primarily impact Vancouver. It wouldn't cause damage in Seattle or Portland. These subduction earthquakes, because they're so huge, impact every single community along the coast over that 1,100 kilometer length, in our case of Cascadia. So Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, communities in Northern California would all be impacted at the same time and would all see damage.
And I guess earlier this summer, we learned some new things about what this quake would be like and where exactly it's likely to happen. Can you explain the report that was published?
Right. So the science has been improving over the past 30 or 40 years, both onshore and offshore studies. The work that was published this summer, which took place just over a year ago, was a ship that deployed instruments and recorded seismic waves along the entire subduction zone. So that was the first time using the same ship, the same tools, the same methodology, that a study of the entire Cascadia subduction zone was undertaken. And what it showed was there are different segments of the Cascadia fault and different segments that may slip differently at the time of the earthquake. First off, they identified these segments, which is new information, and that can help us to better understand ground shaking down the road. But they also identified areas where the fault is a little bit shallower and areas where the fault is a smooth surface. And looking at other faults around the Pacific, they concluded that where the faults were smooth, there tended to be more slip. And so by identifying regions where they expect more slip and especially shallower movement, that has implications for ground shaking, the strength of the ground shaking, and it also has implications for the tsunami generation and how large the tsunami may be in different regions.
What from that information will we actually be able to practically use, whether that's to predict the next one, if that's even possible, or prepare our cities for whatever could come?
What we're really looking for is for our building codes and bridge codes and dam codes to incorporate the latest science and the latest information.
Right.
So that's ultimately where all of this goes, is into our codes and standards that are used for designing important infrastructure and buildings. So it's really, how will the ground shake and how strong and what type of shaking, and how often can we expect that shaking? Is it every 100 years or every 1,000 years? And this information is also really useful for emergency managers who are preparing communities along the coast, knowing how high the tsunami might extend and how strong the shaking might be. So it's information that is used by engineers, but it's also used by emergency managers on a regular basis.
Hey, you. Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend. I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
I want to ask you, if you can, to walk us through, and let's just say for the sake of argument that it happened tomorrow, what this earthquake would actually do to the west coast of Canada, because I think a lot of people have seen, obviously there have been a number of movies made in which this happens, right? Like San Andreas or 2012, and you see these cities buckling and buildings collapsing everywhere, and we've been led to believe that that's the level of disaster we'd be looking at. And I'd love to hear from you sort of, whenever this happens, what do you expect to see, and how sure can we even be about that?
You're right. There are uncertainties in all of this, and very significant uncertainties. So that's one of the challenges. What we're doing is to use the latest information, the latest science, the best tools that are evolving very rapidly, so we can map out how the ground is moving today in terms of deformation and what we expect at the time of one of these subduction earthquakes, how far things will move, how strong the shaking will be, how big the tsunami will be. So we use the latest science, but we also learn from earthquakes around the world, like Chile and Alaska in 1964 and Japan. So we're looking at areas around the world that have similar types of buildings to those in Canada and learning from those more recent subduction earthquakes. So between the science and the comparisons, we know a few things very clearly that, obviously the closer to the fault, the stronger the shaking, and coastal areas that would be impacted and inlets that would be impacted by the tsunami. So we can map out pretty well areas that we know would be impacted by a tsunami and know the arrival time and have some estimates of wave heights. That's all new information. There's a lot of tsunami modeling underway that is being put to use. We also have a good idea of how strong the shaking will be. The strongest shaking will be along the west coast of Vancouver Island. As you move inland, distance is your friend in terms of earthquakes. So by the time you get to Victoria, you're about 75 kilometers from the fault. The shaking won't be as severe as it would be in Tofino or communities right on the west coast, but still very strong shaking in Victoria and all of Vancouver Island that would be damaging shaking. Similarly, as you move towards Vancouver, which is about 125 kilometers from the closest point, the shaking is less severe, but it's still damaging shaking. And what we know from recent earthquakes around the world, we're going to see older buildings most impacted. We're going to see some damage to modern buildings, but we would expect mainly to the older buildings that weren't designed for the strong shaking. Similarly for bridges, the old bridges that weren't designed to modern standards are the ones most expected to be impacted. We would see hundreds of landslides across the region, across Vancouver Island and southwestern British Columbia. Would expect liquefaction in some areas where soil loses its strength. And the recent events in Japan and Chile have really reminded us of the importance of the tsunami, which has had the greatest impact in both Japan and in Chile. Both of those earthquakes in Japan and Chile have shown us how well building codes work in protecting modern buildings, and also have reminded us the importance of public education and individuals knowing what to expect and knowing what to do when that strong shaking begins.
How would this big one compare with Japan and Chile in terms of the kind of damage we might see? Like, are we talking about it's going to be sort of like that and that's what we can expect, or is this bigger?
It would be very similar. We're looking at a similar sized earthquake, similar distances. Santiago is about the same distance as Vancouver from the subduction fault. What we saw in Santiago was damage to older buildings and to some modern buildings as well. A lot of damage and a lot of what we call non-structural damage, where items are falling over within a building, causing damage and potential injuries as well. So the non-structural with cabinets falling over, bookcases, things that, we can protect ourselves from quite easily. But certainly the models for Cascadia earthquake show significant damage across southwestern British Columbia. The estimates would suggest that damage in southwestern British Columbia would be in the order of $40 to $60 billion.
Wow.
And this type of an earthquake, a subduction earthquake, again, because of the footprint, because it impacts so many communities along the West Coast, much more challenging to recover from in those early days and those early weeks, because all of our neighboring communities, Seattle, Portland, have all been impacted in the same way.
So given all of that, I know you mentioned we can kind of use the new data to dig deeper on the time frame, but is there any way to predict when this kind of thing might happen, like beyond, within the span of 100 years or so?
A really good question. And it's the most common question that we get is when. So when someone finds out I'm a seismologist, the question is, when will that earthquake happen? And that's unfortunately the question that we can't answer.
Right.
There's no way to predict one of these earthquakes or to say when they might happen. The best, at this point is looking back in history and trying to understand how many of these events have occurred and how often and when. We know there have been 19 of these in the past 10,000 years, similar magnitude 9 earthquakes, but they're not regular. They're not every 400 or 500 years. Sometimes they're 250 years between events, and other times more like 850 years between events. So they're quite irregular. There's no way to predict them.
So why do people keep saying we're due?
Well, we're in the window, I guess, is probably the best way. So if you look at that window of 250 to 850 years between events, we are at 324 years. So we're in the window. I wouldn't say we're overdue, but these are unpredictable and can occur at any time. We also have other types of earthquakes. In addition to the subduction earthquakes, we have crustal earthquakes as large as magnitude 7, 7.5. And we have earthquakes within that ocean plate that is being pushed beneath us. And those occur much more frequently. So we've had 3 of those in less than 100 years in the magnitude 7 range. So we do have other types of earthquakes as well in southwestern British Columbia.
How prepared for it are we? And I ask that just to get a sense of what we're actually doing on the ground. I know the research and the modeling helps us, but, how up to date are the building codes? How are we changing them regularly? Like, what are we actually doing? How seriously is government taking this?
Yeah, we're making huge advances. The building codes, which are really the primary defense against these earthquakes, are updated every 5 years. The subduction zone earthquake, we didn't know about these until the 1990s.
Right.
So the research that really started showing this in the 1980s and 1990s, this has been incorporated in the building code now for nearly 20 years. It's in the building code. It's in the models. It's information shared with emergency managers. We have things like Shakeout BC, where everyone practices drop cover and hold on in October of every year. And so, good rehearsal for when that shaking begins, knowing what to do and protecting yourself from falling items from that non-structural damage. We're seeing bridges being retrofit. We're seeing schools being retrofit. Buildings are being retrofit when you walk around and see the old buildings downtown that have been modified to withstand earthquakes. We have earthquake drills in schools that never happened when I was a student here in British Columbia. This will all make a huge difference. So we're making really a lot of progress. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot that individuals can and should do to be prepared that would make a difference as well. And we saw that in Chile. If people knew what to do and they were prepared, they did extremely well following that earthquake. People were able to move away from the water, away from the tsunami, and protect themselves from the shaking.
Last question then, because as I mentioned, there are many portrayals of this in popular culture, and it's a topic many people like to discuss. What do you think people don't understand that they need to when we discuss, the big one hitting the West Coast?
Right. Perhaps the biggest misconception is some people who will simply throw their hands up in the air and say, this is so big, there's nothing I can do. And that really is the furthest thing from the truth. This is something that we can deal with, that we can all deal with. And that struck me in Chile. I was in the region of the 8.8 earthquake, and I saw wooden houses that had broken windows, but they were standing and they were in good shape because they were modern, well-designed buildings. And meeting people who survived this earthquake because they knew what to do and they were familiar with what to expect. So this is something that we can all deal with, and it takes different levels. So there's the buildings and bridges that are being retrofit, science that feeds all of that, and the engineering. On a personal level, making sure that there aren't big bookcases or cabinets that are going to fall over and block your door, block your escape, or fall onto you as you're sitting at a desk. Having a flashlight and slippers under your bed so that you can move around after a strong earthquake where there likely will be broken glass and broken items. Some very simple things that we can all do to be prepared for this type of an earthquake. Don't have a heavy picture hanging over your bed that's going to fall on you in the night. So, looking at which rooms you spend the most time in and just looking around and knowing where you'll go when the shaking begins. So lots of simple things. And it's something that we can deal with.
John, thank you so much for this. It's really valuable.
Well, you're most welcome. Thank you for your interest and for all of these great questions.
John Cassidy of Natural Resources Canada and the University of Victoria. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can send us feedback with an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or with a phone call to 416-935-5935. If you are, perhaps, interested in winning some Taylor Swift tickets, I would urge you to listen to a podcast called The Reheat. It is also on our Frequency Podcast Network, and we're giving away a pair. And all you got to do is listen to a few episodes and shoot us a text. The Big Story is available in every single podcast player, and on your smart speaker, just ask it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.
Hey you, Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activate it.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.